The edge of human space was a quiet place. Out past the last farm colonies, past the mining rigs and the sleepy trade stations, there was a small research base called Anchor Point. It floated alone in the dark, far from any sun, held together by steel and stubbornness. Most people in the galaxy had never heard of it. That was the point. Inside Anchor Point, in a hangar bigger than 10 stadiums, sat a ship unlike any other. Its hull was smooth and dark, almost black, with thin lines of blue light running along its sides like veins. It had no name painted on it yet, only a number. ISV-9. The engineers who built it called it something else, though. They called it the Meridian. Dr. Elena Voss stood on a metal platform above the ship, looking down at it, the way a mother looks at a sleeping child. She was 51 years old, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that never seemed to rest. She had spent 11 years of her life building this ship. 11 years of failed tests, burned wiring, and sleepless nights. Now it was finished. "She's ready," said a voice behind her. Elena turned. Captain Marcus Reyes walked up the platform, his boots echoing on the metal grating. He was a broad man in his 40s, with a face that looked like it had seen too many wars and not enough sleep. He commanded the small fleet that guarded Anchor Point, 3 old cruisers and a handful of fighters. It was not much of a fleet, but it was enough to keep this place secret. "She's ready," Elena agreed. "Faster than anything we've ever built. Faster than anything the Vantar have, too." At the mention of the Vantar, Marcus's jaw tightened. The Vantar hegemony was the largest alien power near human space. They were not friends. For 15 years, humanity and the Vantar had circled each other like two dogs that did not quite want to fight, but also did not trust each other enough to relax. There had been no open war, but there had been raids. Spy ships, stolen technology. Twice in the last 5 years, Vantar agents had managed to steal pieces of human engine designs from research stations, less guarded than this one. "You really think they'll come for her?" Marcus asked. Elena did not answer right away. She looked down at the ship again, at the way the blue light pulsed slowly along its hull, like a heartbeat. "I'm counting on it," she said quietly. Marcus frowned. "Elena, that's not funny." "I'm not joking." She turned to face him fully now. "Marcus, I need you to trust me on something. What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room. Not even the base commander knows the whole truth." Marcus's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. Elena had earned his trust many times over the years. He waited. "The Meridian isn't just fast," Elena said. "It's bait." For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Then he laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "Bait? Elena, this ship cost more than 3 colony worlds combined. The Council would skin you alive if they heard you call it bait." "The Council knows," Elena said. "Well, 3 people on the Council know. The rest think it's exactly what it looks like. Our new flagship prototype. The fastest thing humanity has ever built. Hidden out here at Anchor Point for final testing before it enters full production." She paused. "That story needs to leak. Slowly, carefully, so it reaches the right ears. You want the Vantar to steal it." "I want them to try," Elena said. "And I want them to succeed." Marcus stared at her, like she had grown a second head. "You're out of your mind." "Maybe," Elena said, and for the first time that day, something like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Let me show you why." She led him down a narrow staircase, through 2 security checkpoints, and into a small room beneath the main hangar floor. The room was cold, filled with humming servers, and a single console glowing pale white in the dark. Elena sat down at the console, and pulled up a diagram that Marcus did not fully understand. It looked like a spinning knot of light, threads crossing over each other in complicated patterns. 15 years ago, Elena said, when the Vantar first stole pieces of our early drive technology, they got something incomplete, broken, half-finished blueprints for an engine core that we never even built. But they didn't know that. They took what they had, and they built their entire fleet around it. Every Vantar warship, every cargo hauler, every colony transport built in the last decade uses an engine descended from that stolen design. "I know all this," Marcus said. "It's why their ships got so much faster after the Kepler incident." "Right. But here's what nobody outside this room knows." Elena leaned forward. "That stolen design was never meant to work long-term. It had a flaw buried so deep inside the core resonance pattern that it would take a genius 100 years to find it by accident. The Vantar engineers patched around the flaw without ever understanding what it was. They built a fleet on top of a crack in the foundation, and they don't even know the crack is there. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. And the Meridian. The Meridian's engine is the finished version of that same design, Elena said. The completed core, the one they never got to see. And it does something very specific when it activates at full power for the first time outside of a shielded facility. It sends out a resonance pulse, a kind of signal, through subspace. Any engine built on the same broken foundation as the Meridian's core will pick up that pulse like a tuning fork picking up a note, and it will shatter. The room was silent, except for the hum of the servers. "You're telling me," Marcus said slowly, "that if the Vantar steal this ship, and they take it somewhere, and fire up the engine, every engine in the Vantar hegemony that descends from that stolen 15-year-old design will fail," Elena said. "Not just this ship's engine. All of them. Warships, freighters, colony ships, anything running that architecture, anywhere in their territory, the moment the pulse reaches it." Marcus sat down heavily in the chair beside her, his mind racing through the implications. "That's not a weapon, Elena. That's an extinction event for their entire navy." "Not extinction," Elena corrected gently. "Their engines will fail. Their ships will not explode into fireballs, not most of them. The failure is designed to be survivable. A hard shutdown, a burnout, a controlled collapse of the drive core. Crews will live, ships will be stranded, but every single vessel that has that engine architecture will lose the ability to fly faster than sublight speed. Their entire war fleet becomes a fleet of slow, drifting targets, all at once, all on the same day. How do you know it won't kill people?" "Because I built in 3 separate failsafes to make sure the burnout is contained to the drive core and doesn't reach the reactor or the crew compartments," Elena said. "I have tested this pattern on 11 prototype cores in this very facility. 11 times. It works exactly as designed, every time." Marcus rubbed his face with both hands. Why? Why not just tell the council? Why not build a fleet to match them properly, out in the open? "Because we don't have the resources to outbuild the Vantar hegemony," Elena said, her voice suddenly tired. "They have 11 times our population. 60 times our industrial output. If this becomes an open war of ships being built faster than ships can be destroyed, we lose. It's simple mathematics. We cannot win a war of numbers, but we can win a war of one perfect trap, set once, and sprung only when they take the bait themselves. And if they never take the bait, then we have the fastest ship in the galaxy, and no harm done," Elena said. "But Marcus, they always take the bait. They've stolen from us 4 times in 15 years. They cannot resist it. Their entire military doctrine right now is built around closing the technology gap with humanity, by theft rather than invention. It's cheaper for them, faster, and it's worked for them every time before." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the spinning diagram of light on the screen. "Does the president know?" he finally asked. "The president, the Secretary of Defense, and General Okafor," Elena said. "That's the whole list. I need it to stay that way. If word leaks that the Meridian is a trap, the Vantar will hear about it within a month. Their intelligence network inside our space is better than anyone likes to admit. So what do you need from me?" Elena's eyes were steady now, all trace of tiredness gone. "I need you to make Anchor Point look exactly as guarded as it should be. Not too weak, or they'll smell a trick. Not too strong, or they won't risk the raid. I need your fleet to put up a real fight when they come. A fight you're meant to lose." Marcus let out a long breath. "You're asking me to let good men and women fly into a losing battle." "I'm asking you to fly a battle where nobody has to die," Elena said. "I've seen your defense plans, Marcus. I know you can make it look desperate without making it deadly. Evasive maneuvers, strategic retreats, a fight that looks like everything, but costs us nothing but pride." Marcus considered this for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right. But if I lose one person under my command chasing your trap, Elena, I will make sure the whole galaxy knows what you did." "That's fair," Elena said. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Over the next 3 weeks, the story began to spread, exactly as Elena had planned. It started small. a supply officer at a trade station, mentioning to a merchant that Anchor Point had received an unusually large shipment of exotic materials. A junior engineer bragging in a private message to a friend about working on the fastest thing humanity has ever built. A budget line item, deliberately left slightly too visible in a report that Elena knew would eventually cross a compromised desk. Elena had learned, over her years fighting this quiet war of secrets, that people rarely believed things they were told directly. They believed things they thought they had discovered themselves. So she built a trail of breadcrumbs and let others do the work of following it. It took 19 days for the first signs to appear. A Vantar merchant ship, one that human intelligence had flagged years earlier as a likely front for their spy network, changed its usual trade route and began making slow passes near the outer edge of human territory. It came no closer than the treaty lines allowed. But it lingered. Elena watched the reports come in with a strange, quiet satisfaction. Marcus watched them with dread. "They're scouting us," he said, standing in the small command room at Anchor Point, looking at the sensor logs. "That merchant ship has passed by 4 times this week. It's not trading anything, it's mapping our patrol patterns." "Good," Elena said. "Good?" Marcus repeated, incredulous. "Elena, in a few weeks that ship is going to report back, and then we're going to have a Vantar strike force showing up at our door." "That's the plan," Elena said simply. She was not being callous. She understood, better than most, what it meant to send people into danger. She had a nephew serving on one of the human border cruisers 3 systems away. She knew the weight of what she was doing. But she had also spent 15 years watching the Vantar grow stronger, while humanity scrambled to keep pace, spending resources it did not have, to chase a technological gap it could never fully close, through simple competition. This was not the reckless plan of someone who did not understand the cost. It was the careful plan of someone who understood the cost too well, and had chosen to pay it once, on her own terms, rather than pay it slowly, forever, on someone else's. Lieutenant Sarah Chen was 26 years old, one of the youngest officers stationed at Anchor Point, and one of only a dozen people who had any inkling that something unusual was happening. She was not read into the full plan. She only knew that Dr. Voss had personally requested her for a special assignment. She would be the pilot who flew the Meridian during its final test flights, the ones that were meant to be seen by watching Vantar scouts. Sarah had grown up on a farm colony on the edge of settled space, the kind of place where children learned to fix machinery before they learned to read. She had joined the fleet at 18, driven by a simple, stubborn desire to matter, to do something bigger than tending crops under an artificial sun. She had earned her pilot's wings through raw talent and harder work than anyone else in her class. When Dr. Voss had personally selected her to fly the fastest ship in human history, she had not asked many questions. She had simply said yes. "You'll fly her on 3 test runs," Elena told her, the day before the first flight. "Standard patterns, nothing dangerous. You are not authorized to engage full drive power under any circumstances. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said. "Can I ask why?" Elena hesitated, then decided that this much at least, Sarah deserved to know. "Because when this ship reaches full drive power for the first time outside of a shielded facility, something happens. Something that cannot happen while you are the one flying her." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, but she did not push further. There was a kind of trust in the fleet, an old and simple trust, that said, if your commanding officer tells you not to press a button, you do not press the button, even if you do not know why. "Understood," she said. The first test flight went smoothly. Sarah took the Meridian out beyond the edge of the asteroid field that ringed Anchor Point, put her through a series of graceful turns and short bursts of speed that were, even at their most restrained, faster than anything Sarah had ever flown before. She brought the ship back in 81 minutes, breathless with excitement despite herself. "She's incredible," Sarah told Elena afterward, still catching her breath in the cockpit. "Even holding back like you told me to. She moves like nothing I've ever felt." "She's not finished showing you yet," Elena said, with a small, private smile. 3 days later, sensors at Anchor Point picked up a faint, unfamiliar signal near the edge of the system, gone again within seconds. Marcus's tactical officer flagged it immediately. A burst transmission, encrypted, sent in the direction of Vantar space. Marcus found Elena in her lab that evening, and told her without preamble. "They know," Someone out there just confirmed it and sent the report home. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, then she opened them, and her voice was steady. Then it begins. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. How long do you think we have? Based on the distance to the nearest Vantar staging point, Elena said, and how quickly they've moved in the past. 2 weeks. Maybe 3. Marcus nodded slowly, already running through defense plans in his head, already thinking about how to arrange a fight his people could survive losing. Outside the window of Elena's lab, the Meridian sat quietly in its hangar, blue light pulsing steadily along its hull, like something patient and something waiting. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was nothing left to say. The trap had been baited. Now it only remained to see if the largest and hungriest predator in the region would finally take the bite that would break its own teeth. Far across the dark distance between the stars, on a world with 3 moons and skies the color of rust, the report from the merchant ship reached the desk of Grand Marshal Kesh Doran. Doran was not a young officer. He had spent 40 years climbing the ranks of the Vantar military, and he had done it the old-fashioned way, through patience, through caution, and through a sharp eye for opportunity. He was tall for a Vantar, with gray-plated skin and deep-set eyes that missed very little. He read the report twice before he set it down on his desk. The humans have built something new, said his aide, a younger officer named Ressa Vol, standing at attention across the desk. Our scout confirms it. A prototype vessel, faster than anything currently in either fleet. It has been undergoing testing at a remote research station called Anchor Point, near the border. How fast? Doran asked. Estimates suggest it could outrun our fastest interceptors by a wide margin, Ressa said. If the humans put this design into full production, it would close much of the gap between our fleets. Perhaps erase it. Doran leaned back in his chair, considering this. The Vantar hegemony had built its advantage over the humans slowly, patiently, over 15 years. Some of that advantage had come from honest engineering, but a great deal of it, if Doran was honest with himself, had come from the work of the hegemony's intelligence corps, quietly acquiring pieces of human technology and folding them into Vantar designs. It was not something spoken of openly in official channels, but every officer above a certain rank understood how the fleet had grown so quickly. How well is this station defended? Doran asked. Modestly, Ressa said. 3 aging cruisers, a squadron of fighters, standard defense platforms. Nothing that would trouble a proper strike force. The humans appear to be relying on the station's remote location for security, rather than its firepower. Doran drummed his fingers on the desk. A part of him, the cautious part that had kept him alive and promoted for 40 years, wondered why a facility holding something so valuable would be guarded so lightly. But another part of him, the part that had watched the hegemony grow strong through boldness and quick action, saw only opportunity. The humans were clever, but they were few. They could not defend every border post with a full battle fleet. This was simply what it looked like when a smaller power tried to hide its treasures in the dark and hope no one came looking. Assemble a strike force, Doran said finally. Small, fast. I don't want a war fleet crossing the border and giving the humans an excuse to call it an act of aggression. I want 6 raiders, our best pilots, and enough firepower to overwhelm 3 old cruisers without difficulty. We take the ship, we retreat before any human reinforcements can arrive, and we bring their new prototype home to our engineers. And if the humans resist heavily, Ressa asked, then we destroy what defenses stand in our way, and take the prize regardless, Doran said. The humans have shown restraint in every previous incident. They complain through diplomatic channels. They tighten their security a little. They do not retaliate with force. I see no reason to expect anything different this time. Ressa saluted and turned to leave, then paused at the door. Grand Marshal, if I may ask, why does this feel too easy? Doran allowed himself a small, thin smile. Because it is easy, Ressa. The humans think in straight lines. They build their treasures and then they try to hide them. And when we find them anyway, they wring their hands and write angry letters to the Border Commission. It has worked this way for 15 years. There is no reason it will not work this way again. Ressa nodded and left the room. Doran sat alone for a moment longer, looking at the star chart on his wall, tracing the distance between his own command and the quiet, unremarkable research station called Anchor Point. He did not know, could not have known, that the humans he thought he understood so well had spent 15 years, learning exactly how he thought, and had built their trap around every single one of his assumptions. The order went out within the hour. 6 raider ships, fast and heavily armed, began quiet preparations in a hidden staging area, 2 systems from the border. Their crews were told only that this was a valuable retrieval mission, the kind they had carried out successfully many times before. None of them had any reason to think this time would be different. Back at Anchor Point, Elena Voss received word through her own careful channels that Vantar ships had begun moving in a pattern consistent with raid preparation. She sat alone in her lab that night, looking at the diagram of spinning light on her console, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel afraid. Not of failure, of success, of what it would mean, in 3 weeks or 2, when the largest fleet in the region began to break apart all at once, and the galaxy learned what quiet, patient humans were capable of building when they were pushed far enough. Then she closed the file, turned off the console, and went to check on the ship one more time, before she allowed herself to sleep. 19 days after Grand Marshal Doran gave his order, 6 Vantar raider ships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Anchor Point system. It was the middle of the night cycle at the station, though in space there was no real difference between night and day. Most of the crew were resting. A skeleton watch manned the sensors and the defense platforms, as was standard for a quiet remote posting. That was exactly how Marcus Reyes had planned it. A base that was fully alert around the clock would look suspicious. A base with a normal, sleepy rotation would look real. The first alarm came from a young sensor technician named Priya Malhotra, barely 3 months out of training. Her hands were shaking as she called it in. Contact. Multiple contacts. Bearing 317. Decelerating from hyperspace. I count 6. No. 6 confirmed. Vantar Raider class signatures. Marcus was in the command center within 90 seconds, still pulling his uniform jacket over his shoulders. He had been sleeping in his boots for the past week, waiting for exactly this call. Sound general quarters, he ordered. Get the cruisers moving. I want the Meridian's hangar sealed, and every non-essential system in that hangar running dark. Nobody touches the ship's engine core. Nobody. If a fire alarm goes off in that hangar, my answer is still no. The base klaxons began to wail. Crew members scrambled from their bunks toward stations they had drilled for 100 times, but never truly expected to use. In the hangar bay, Sarah Chen was already awake. She had barely been sleeping the past week, some instinct keeping her alert, and she reached the Meridian's cockpit in record time, though her orders were clear. She was not to fly the ship into any engagement. She was only to be ready to move it, to protect it, if the base's defenses somehow failed entirely. Outside, in the cold dark of the system, the 3 aging human cruisers began to move into a defensive formation. Their captains had been briefed only partially. They knew this was meant to look like a real fight, and they knew there was a very good reason for it, even if they did not know the full plan. They followed Marcus's orders without question, the way soldiers do when they trust the person giving them. The 6 Vantar raiders closed in fast. They were smaller than the human cruisers individually, but faster, more heavily armed for their size, and there were 6 of them against 3. Grand Marshal Doran had chosen his numbers carefully. This was meant to be an easy, decisive fight. Cruisers, hold formation at the outer marker, Marcus ordered over the comm. Fighters, launch and screen. We slow them down. We do not let them reach the station in under 12 minutes. After that, fall back toward the second defense line, and keep falling back. Do you understand me? I want this to look like a retreat, not a rout. Controlled. Ugly. But controlled. Copy that, sir, came the reply from Captain Nikemalu, aboard the cruiser Halloway. 12 minutes, then we bleed them for distance. The battle that followed was fierce, at least on the surface. Human fighters darted between the incoming raiders, firing quick bursts before peeling away. The cruisers laid down covering fire, their old but reliable weapons scoring hits against Vantar shielding. From a distance, or from the perspective of a Vantar sensor operator, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. A small, outmatched human garrison fighting hard and losing slowly. What the Vantar could not see was the careful choreography behind it. Marcus had drilled his people relentlessly over the past 2 weeks on exactly how to make a fight look desperate without letting anyone get killed. Fighters broke off before taking fatal hits. Cruisers presented their most heavily armored faces to enemy fire. Every retreat was timed to a plan that existed only in Marcus's head and in the sealed orders he had given his captains. Still, it was not without cost. A human fighter took a glancing hit and spun out of control, its pilot ejecting just in time, drifting in a survival pod that would need to be recovered later. The cruiser Holloway took a hard strike along its port side, knocking out 2 weapon batteries and injuring 3 crew members badly enough that they were rushed to the medical bay. It was not the bloodless theater Marcus had hoped for. War, even staged war, had teeth. 11 minutes in, the Vantar raiders broke through the outer defense line. "They're through," Priya called from the sensor station. "Bearing directly for the station, all 6 ships, weapons hot." "Fall back to the second line," Marcus ordered, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "Cruisers, cover the retreat. Fighters, screen the station approach. Do not let them get an easy shot at the hangar bay." The Vantar raiders pressed their advantage, exactly as Doran had planned. They pushed past the retreating human cruisers, ignoring most of the covering fire, focused entirely on their objective, the research station itself, and whatever prize was hidden inside it. Aboard the lead raider, a young Vantar strike commander named Torv Sella watched the human station grow larger on his view screen. His scans had already located the largest hangar bay on the station, the one with unusually thick shielding for a facility this size. It was exactly where intelligence had said the prototype would be kept. "Target the hangar shielding," Torv ordered. "Concentrated fire, all ships. We punch through, and we take the ship intact. Boarding teams, prepare for immediate deployment the moment we breach." The 6 raiders opened fire together, a concentrated barrage aimed at the section of the station's hull protecting the Meridian's hangar. The shielding held for nearly 90 seconds, long enough, Marcus knew, to look like a real defense, before it buckled and gave way, exactly as it had been designed to do under this level of sustained fire. Inside the hangar, alarms blared as the outer doors were breached. Sarah Chen sat in the Meridian's cockpit, her hands tight on the controls, watching through the canopy as the massive hangar doors tore open, and the cold dark of space poured in around the edges of the emergency containment field. "Sarah, get clear." Marcus's voice came over her comm, tight with something that was not quite panic, but was close to it. "Get clear now, that's an order." "Copy," Sarah said, and she felt something twist in her stomach as she disengaged the docking clamps and eased the Meridian back from its cradle, exactly as she had been trained to do in this exact scenario, weeks before she ever expected to actually do it. Vantar boarding shuttles poured through the breach, small fast craft carrying strike teams equipped for exactly this kind of operation. Sarah's orders were explicit. She was not to fight them. She was to make it look like she tried to escape with the ship, fail, and eject safely, before the Vantar could capture her along with it. The ship was the bait. She was not meant to be part of the catch. She guided the Meridian in a wide, desperate-looking arc across the hangar, weapons fire streaking past her canopy, carefully aimed by the Vantar boarding teams to disable rather than destroy, exactly as their orders specified, because a wrecked prize was worth nothing to them. 2 shots struck the Meridian's outer hull, close enough to look convincing, far enough from anything critical to do no real damage. Sarah felt the ship shudder around her, and on cue, she triggered the ejection sequence. Her escape pod launched a half-second before a Vantar boarding shuttle latched onto the Meridian's hull, and she watched through the pod's small viewport as her ship, the fastest thing humanity had ever built, was captured by exactly the enemy it had been built to capture. Pod away," she called over the emergency channel, her voice steadier than she felt. "The Meridian is taken. I say again, the Meridian is taken." In the command center, Marcus watched the same scene unfold on his tactical display, his hands gripping the edge of his console so tightly, his knuckles had gone white. Every instinct he had built over 20 years of service screamed at him to send everything he had to stop this, to not simply watch the enemy take his ship. But he held the line, because he trusted Elena, because he had seen the diagram of spinning light with his own eyes, and because he understood, on some level deeper than instinct, that this moment of loss was the doorway to something much larger. "All units, fall back to the 3rd defense perimeter," he ordered, his voice carrying none of the turmoil in his chest. "Let them go. I say again, let them go. Do not pursue." The order confused several of his officers. Pursuing a fleeing enemy who had just stolen critical technology, seemed like exactly the wrong moment to stand down. But orders were orders, and Marcus's people trusted him enough to follow, even when they did not fully understand. Aboard his flagship, Grand Marshal Doran received the confirmation with quiet satisfaction. "The prototype is secured?" "Confirmed, Grand Marshal," Torv Sella reported. "The ship is intact, minimal damage. The human pilot ejected safely. We suffered no losses. The human defense force is falling back, and shows no sign of pursuit." "As expected," Doran said. "Bring it home. Full speed, direct route. I want our engineers examining that drive core within the day." Torv acknowledged the order and set course immediately, eager to complete the mission and return to a hero's welcome. The captured Meridian, now under Vantar control, was towed briefly clear of the battle before its new operators, a small technical crew who had trained for weeks on human ship interfaces, using data stolen by Vantar intelligence over the preceding months, began powering up its systems for the journey home. It took them nearly 40 minutes to feel confident enough in their understanding of the unfamiliar human controls to attempt the ship's own engine, rather than relying on the raider fleet to tow it. 40 minutes of careful, methodical work, cross-referencing every system against stolen schematics, testing basic functions before committing to anything larger. This was standard procedure for the Vantar Technical Corps, and it was, in a strange way, exactly the kind of patient carefulness that made them so good at stealing technology in the first place. At the 41-minute mark, satisfied that they understood enough of the ship's basic operation to proceed safely, the Vantar technical crew engaged the Meridian's main engine for the first time. Deep within the ship's core, the drive that Elena Voss had spent 11 years perfecting came alive. Blue light raced along the hull in bright, pulsing waves, faster and faster, building toward a speed that no engine built by human or Vantar hands had ever reached before. The ship leapt forward, falling into pace alongside the raider fleet, with a smoothness that made the Vantar technical crew murmur in surprised approval over their comm channels. None of them noticed the small secondary readout, tucked deep in a diagnostic subsystem they had not yet learned to interpret, that began counting down from 3 minutes, the moment the engine reached full operational power. None of them could have known what that countdown meant. Only 2 people in the entire galaxy understood, with certainty, exactly what was about to happen. Elena Voss, sitting in her lab back at Anchor Point, with her eyes fixed on a live feed of the retreating Vantar fleet, and somewhere far across Vantar space, an engine core, deep inside a warship that had never once been told it was already broken. The countdown reached 0. Back at Anchor Point, the mood in the command center was heavy and strange. The battle was over. The station's defenses had held just long enough, and failed exactly where they were meant to fail. Damage reports were coming in. The injured crew from the Halloway, the downed fighter pilot now recovered safely from her survival pod, scorch marks along the hangar bay that would take weeks to repair. It looked, to everyone in that room except Marcus and a handful of others, like a costly and humiliating defeat. "Sir," said Priya Malhotra quietly, still sitting at her sensor station, her voice shaking slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "They're gone. The Vantar fleet has broken orbit. They're taking the Meridian with them." "I know," Marcus said. He did not look away from the tactical display, where 6 small icons representing the Vantar raiders, and 1 representing his own stolen ship, moved steadily away from Anchor Point and toward the border. "Sir, with respect," said Captain Nkemelu, patched in from the damaged Halloway, her voice tight with barely restrained anger. "We just lost the most valuable piece of technology this fleet has ever built, and we let them walk away with it. 3 of my crew are in the medical bay. I'd like to understand why we didn't pursue." Marcus understood her anger. He had trained her, promoted her, trusted her with a command of her own, and he had just watched her ship take real damage, and her crew take real injuries, in service of a plan she knew nothing about. He owed her more than silence, but he had also given his word to Elena, and there were only a handful of hours left before that word would be repaid in full, one way or another. "Captain, I need you to trust me for a little while longer," he said. "I promise you, every officer who fought today, and every officer who was injured today, is going to understand exactly why, before this week is over. I can't tell you more than that right now, but I need you to hold the line and take care of your people. Can you do that?" There was a long pause over the comm. Then, grudgingly, Nkemelu answered, Yes, sir, I can do that. Elena Voss had not been in the command center during the battle. She had watched it from her lab, from a private feed patched directly into the base's sensor network, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes never leaving the screen. She had watched the Meridian get captured. She had watched Sarah Chen eject safely. She had watched the Vantar fleet begin its long journey home, towing, and then finally flying the ship that would, in less than an hour, begin the process of quietly breaking the largest military force in the region. She checked the clock. The Vantar fleet had engaged the Meridian's main drive 38 minutes ago. According to the telemetry, her hidden systems were still quietly gathering from the ship's own transmitters. Transmitters the Vantar boarding team had not yet found or disabled. 38 minutes. If her calculations were correct, the resonance pulse would trigger any moment now. She did not move. She barely breathed. 11 years of work had come down to this. A countdown she could not see, running inside a ship she could no longer control, somewhere in the dark distance between two hostile powers. On the bridge of Grand Marshal Doran's flagship, 3 systems away from where the Raider fleet was now traveling with its prize, Communications Officer Yenny Carr was monitoring routine fleet channels when the first strange report came through. "Grand Marshal," she said, frowning at her console, "I'm receiving an automated distress beacon from the frigate Ashkelon. Engine failure. Complete drive core shutdown." Doran, who had been reviewing supply reports at his command station, looked up with mild irritation rather than alarm. Engine failures happened. Ships were complex machines, and complex machines occasionally broke. "Note it and forward the report to fleet maintenance. Where is the Ashkelon stationed?" "The outer patrol line, near the Korovin system," Yenny said. Then, a moment later, her frown deepened. "Sir, I'm getting a second beacon. The cruiser Maddox Point. Same signature. Complete drive core shutdown." Doran set down the report he had been holding. 2 ships, same failure, at the same time. What's the distance between them? Yenny checked her instruments, and something in her posture changed, a stiffness entering her shoulders. "Sir, the Maddox Point isn't anywhere near the Korovin system. It's stationed at the training grounds near Velkash, on the opposite side of our territory." The bridge went quiet for a moment. 2 ships, thousands of light years apart, suffering the exact same catastrophic engine failure within seconds of each other, was not a coincidence any experienced officer would accept easily. "Pull up a fleet-wide status board," Doran ordered, an edge entering his voice now. "All vessels, I want to know if this is isolated." Yenny's hands moved quickly over her console, and the answer came back faster than anyone in that command room was prepared for. The board that appeared on the main view screen was not the calm, orderly grid of green status lights that fleet officers were accustomed to seeing. It was a wall of red, spreading across the display even as they watched, ship after ship after ship, reporting the same impossible failure, at nearly the same impossible moment. A supply convoy near the homeworld, a squadron of interceptors patrolling the border, a colony transport carrying 4,000 settlers, now drifting powerless between systems. The frigate Ashkelon, the cruiser Maddox Point, dozens of vessels, then hundreds. "Grand Marshal," Yenny said, her voice no longer steady at all, "I don't understand what I'm looking at. This can't be right. This can't possibly all be happening at once." Doran stood slowly from his command chair, his eyes fixed on the spreading wall of red across the screen, a cold and unfamiliar feeling beginning to settle into his chest. A feeling he had not experienced in a very long time, and one that his 40 years of careful, patient service had never quite prepared him to recognize. It was the feeling of a trap closing, long after the moment it could have been avoided. "Get me Torvsella," he said quietly. "Get me the Raider fleet, now." But even as the order left his mouth, the ship-wide comm crackled to life with an emergency channel he had not opened, carrying a message relayed automatically from his own flagship's engineering deck. "Grand Marshal, this is Chief Engineer Vass. We are reading a critical fault building in our own primary drive core. I don't understand the readings. They don't match any failure pattern in our database. Requesting immediate." The transmission cut off, replaced by a deep, grinding shudder that ran through the entire ship, felt by every soul aboard, from the bridge crew standing frozen around their stations, to the deckhands 3 levels below, all of them feeling the great vessel around them groan, like something alive and wounded. The lights on the bridge flickered, dimmed, and for one long terrible moment, went out entirely, plunging Grand Marshal Kesh Doran and everyone around him into darkness, 3 systems away from a small research station, where a woman named Elena Voss sat perfectly still, watching a countdown on her screen, finally reach a number she had waited 11 years to see. 0. And then, across the width of an entire empire, silence. When the emergency lights flickered back on aboard Doran's flagship a few seconds later, dim and red and strange, the bridge crew found themselves standing in a ship that no longer hummed with the familiar vibration of a working drive core. The silence was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. Chief Engineer Vass's voice returned over the comm a moment later, shaken and hoarse. Grand Marshal, the primary drive core has suffered a full shutdown. Containment held, there is no reactor breach, no casualties reported on the engineering deck. But the core itself is dead. I've never seen anything like this. It didn't overheat. It didn't malfunction in any way I recognize. It's as if something reached inside the core and simply switched it off. Doran said nothing for a long moment. He stood in the dim red light of his own bridge, surrounded by officers who were beginning to receive, one after another, reports of the same impossible failure from every corner of Vantar space. And he understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water down his spine, that whatever had just happened to his fleet had happened because of the ship his raiders had captured only 40 minutes earlier. "Get me a channel to Torvsella," he said again, quieter this time. "I want to know the status of the Meridian, now." It took several minutes to establish contact, minutes during which the wall of red on the main screen continued to spread, ship after ship after ship. When Torvsella's voice finally came through, it carried the same shaken disbelief that had settled over every other Vantar officer that night. "Grand Marshal, the human ship's drive core has also gone dark, exactly like the others. We were monitoring it closely when the failure occurred. And Grand Marshal," his voice hesitated, as though reluctant to say what came next, "my own ship's engine failed, at the exact same moment. Every raider in the strike force lost primary drive power simultaneously. We are dead in space, alongside the very ship we were bringing home." Doran closed his eyes. Somewhere, quietly, a small and honest part of him understood exactly what had happened, even before his engineers could confirm it with data and diagrams. The humans had let this happen, not through weakness, not through a battle honestly lost. Through patience, and design, and a willingness to lose a single ship and a single battle, in exchange for something far larger. He thought of everything he had said to Ressa Vol 3 weeks earlier, standing in this very command room. It has worked this way for 15 years. There is no reason it will not work this way again. He had been wrong. Around him, the reports continued to arrive, painting a picture that no officer in Vantar history had ever had to comprehend before. Not a fleet weakened by battle, not a fleet reduced by attrition, but an entire military power, built patiently over a decade on a foundation nobody had ever known was cracked, brought to its knees in the span of 3 silent minutes, by the very same trick it had used against its enemy so many times before. Grand Marshal Doran opened his eyes, looked around at his darkened bridge, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had spent his whole career studying his enemies, that the war he had assumed would never truly begin had just been fought and lost, without a single shot fired at his home fleet, in less time than it took to brew a pot of tea. By the time the sun rose over the Vantar homeworld, if it could be called rising when so many ships in orbit above it had gone dark and drifting, the scale of the disaster was only beginning to be understood. In the capital city of Thravash Prime, the Vantar High Council convened in an emergency session before dawn. The council chamber, usually a place of slow, careful debate, was filled instead with raised voices and frightened aides running in and out with fresh reports. Councillor Yeshka Morn, the oldest member present and the closest thing the council had to a calm center, banged her staff against the floor 3 times to bring the room to order. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying despite her age. "Shouting at each other will not restart a single engine. I want a clear report. Grand Marshal Doran, are you able to join us?" Doran's face appeared on the chamber's central screen, transmitted from his still powerless flagship, lit only by the dim emergency lighting that had kept most of his crew alive and functioning through the night. He looked older than he had the day before, The confidence that had carried him through 40 years of service had been replaced by something far more careful. "Counselor Morn," he said, "I can report, though I cannot yet report good news. As of this hour, we have confirmed drive core failures across 412 vessels, spanning every fleet in Vantar territory. The number is still rising, as more distant outposts report in. Every failed vessel shares one thing in common: an engine core, built on the design architecture we adopted approximately 14 years ago." "The design taken from the humans," said Counselor Threlvan, a sharp-featured man whose family had long profited from the technology transfer programs that had funded much of the fleet's expansion. "Yes," Doran said simply. There was no point denying it now, not with the evidence written across every ship in the fleet. A murmur ran through the chamber. Everyone present had known, in the vague and comfortable way that powerful people know inconvenient truths, that a great deal of Vantar military technology had originated from stolen human designs. It had never been discussed so openly, so bluntly, in this chamber before. "Our engineers have been examining the failure pattern through the night," Doran continued. "What we understand so far is this. Every affected engine core contains a resonance chamber built to a specific structural pattern, a pattern present in the original blueprints acquired 14 years ago and carried forward, with modifications, into every subsequent generation of our drive technology. Approximately 40 minutes after the captured human vessel activated its own engine core for the first time, a resonance signal propagated through subspace and reached every engine sharing that same structural pattern, anywhere in our territory, simultaneously. The signal caused an immediate, total shutdown of each affected drive core." "You are telling us," said Counselor Morn slowly, "that the humans built a weapon into their own ship, allowed us to steal it, and used it to disable our entire navy in a single moment." "That is my current assessment, yes," Doran said. The chamber erupted into noise again, and this time, even Counselor Morn's staff, striking the floor twice more, could not fully restore order. Voices called out demands, for retaliation, for investigation, for someone to be held responsible, for reassurance that could not honestly be given. "How many casualties?" Morn finally asked, once the room had quieted enough for her to be heard. Doran consulted a datapad before answering. "Remarkably few, given the scale of the failure. My engineers report that the shutdown pattern appears deliberately contained. The drive cores lost power in a controlled manner, rather than exploding or venting radiation. We have confirmed injuries aboard 11 vessels, mostly from crew members thrown by the sudden loss of artificial gravity stabilization during the failure. We have 3 confirmed deaths, aboard a mining vessel that was operating in a hazardous asteroid field at the moment its engines failed and drifted into a collision it could not avoid. 3 deaths. It was, by any measure of military disaster, a shockingly small number, and several council members seemed to note this with a strange, uneasy relief that did nothing to calm the deeper fear building in the room. A weapon this precise, this carefully controlled, capable of disabling an entire navy, while sparing nearly every life aboard, was in some ways more frightening than a weapon that simply destroyed everything in its path. It suggested a level of confidence and mastery that the Vantar hegemony had never credited to its human neighbors. "What is our current military capability?" asked Counselor Van, his earlier bravado gone, replaced by something closer to genuine fear. Doran did not soften the answer. "Severely reduced. Approximately 70% of our active fleet, by ship count, relied on the affected engine architecture. Those vessels are not destroyed, but they are without faster-than-light capability, until their drive cores can be rebuilt from the ground up, a process my engineers estimate will take between 8 months and 2 years per vessel, depending on shipyard capacity. Our remaining 30%, primarily older vessels predating the stolen design, and a small number of newer prototypes using a different architecture, remain fully operational. In practical terms, Counselor, our Navy has lost most of its ability to project force beyond a single system for the foreseeable future." The silence that followed this statement was heavier than any of the shouting that had come before it. Far from the council chamber, in the drifting hulk of his own flagship, Grand Marshal Doran ended the transmission and sat alone in his darkened command chair, watching through the viewport as small emergency shuttles moved between the powerless ships of his once proud fleet, ferrying supplies and technical crews between vessels that would not fly again for months, if ever. He thought of Ressavol's question, 3 weeks earlier. Why does this feel too easy? He had dismissed her instincts then. He did not intend to dismiss them again. News of the disaster did not stay contained within Vantar space for long. Word traveled quickly through the tangled trade networks and diplomatic channels that connected the region's various powers, and within days, every government within 100 light-years knew, in broad strokes, what had happened to the largest military force in the sector. Reactions varied. Some smaller powers, long resentful of Vantar dominance and the aggressive border policies that had come with it, celebrated quietly, seeing an opportunity in the weakened state of their largest neighbor. A confederation of independent trade worlds along the Vantar border, which had endured years of unfavorable trade terms enforced by the threat of Vantar warships, began almost immediately renegotiating agreements from a position of newfound strength. Two smaller neighboring species, the Corvi Concord and the Ith Assembly, began quiet military buildups of their own along their shared borders with Vantar territory, wary that a wounded predator might still be dangerous, but equally aware that a wounded predator was, for the first time in a generation, no longer the apex power in the region. At Anchor Point, the celebration that Elena Voss had half expected did not come. Instead, the mood among the crew was quiet, thoughtful, almost solemn, once the full scope of what had happened became clear through the intelligence reports trickling in over the following days. Marcus Reyes found Elena in her lab, 3 days after the resonance pulse had triggered, reading through the latest intelligence summary, with an expression that was difficult to read. "You were right," he said, without preamble, setting a datapad down on her desk. Confirmed failures across their entire fleet architecture. 70% of their combat capability, gone, in 3 minutes. And almost no casualties. You actually did it. "I know," Elena said quietly. "You don't sound happy about it." Elena set down the pad she had been reading and rubbed her eyes, the exhaustion of the past weeks finally catching up with her now that the waiting was over. "I'm relieved, Marcus. I'm relieved that it worked exactly as designed, that we didn't kill thousands of people, that the plan I built actually did what I promised it would do. But happy isn't the word I'd use. We just crippled an entire civilization's ability to defend itself. There are children on Vantar worlds tonight who are frightened because their planet's defenses just failed, for reasons nobody there understands yet. I don't take joy in that, even knowing it was necessary." Marcus sat down slowly across from her. "Do you think it was necessary?" "I think," Elena said carefully, "that a Vantar hegemony capable of doing this to us first, without hesitation, was a threat we could not have survived indefinitely. I think every stolen piece of technology over the past 15 years was a small step toward a war we would eventually have lost, and I think a single, contained, precisely targeted action that stops that war before it starts, at the cost of 3 accidental deaths, instead of the millions a real war would have cost, was the least terrible option available to us." She paused. "But I also think it's important that we never get comfortable with what we just did. The moment we stop feeling the weight of it is the moment we become the kind of power we built this plan to stop." Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing this. Outside the small window of Elena's lab, the hangar, where the Meridian had once sat, now empty and scarred from the battle, was being slowly repaired by work crews rotating through double shifts. "What happens now?" he asked. Elena looked up at him, and for the first time in weeks, something like uncertainty crossed her face. "Now, I think, we find out whether the Vantar hegemony responds to this like a wounded animal that lashes out, or like an empire that finally understands. It needs to change how it does business with its neighbors. And I think, whichever way they choose, humanity needs to be ready to respond with strength, but also with restraint. We won this round by being patient and precise. If we throw that away now by acting rashly, we'll have wasted everything this cost us." 3 systems away, aboard his slowly repairing flagship, Grand Marshal Kesh Doran received a priority message from the High Council, informing him that a formal commission had been established to investigate the circumstances of the disaster, and that he was to report to Threvash Prime in person within the week to account for his decisions. He read the message twice, then set it aside and turned back to the ongoing damage reports still streaming in from across his shattered fleet, wondering, not for the first time in the past 3 days, whether the humans he had so badly underestimated were watching his empire's response with patience of their own, waiting to see what kind of neighbor the Vantar hegemony would choose to become, now that its teeth had finally been pulled. The Vantar investigation into the cause of the failure moved quickly, driven by fear and necessity in equal measure. A team of the hegemony's finest engineers, led by a meticulous and soft-spoken researcher named Dr. Prel Kessin, was assembled within 2 days and given unlimited access to the wreckage of the captured human vessel, still drifting alongside the disabled raider fleet where it had been taken. Kessin had spent 30 years studying drive systems, most of that time working with technology that had originated, one step removed or another, from stolen human designs. She approached the dead Meridian with a mixture of professional curiosity and something close to dread, aware that whatever she found inside that silent hull would likely reshape Vantar military doctrine for a generation. "The core is intact," she reported to her team, 3 hours into the examination, floating in a hard suit through the ship's darkened engineering section, her helmet lamp casting long shadows across surfaces that hummed with none of the energy they had carried only days before. It didn't burn out. It didn't rupture. It simply stopped, in the same controlled way every other affected core stopped. This wasn't an accident or a flaw. This was designed. Her junior engineer, a nervous young Vantar named Oret Bassa, floated beside her, running a scanner slowly along the core's outer casing. "Doctor, I'm reading something strange in the resonance chamber geometry. It's similar to our own core architecture, but the internal structure is completed in a way ours never was. It's like looking at a finished building, next to one that was abandoned halfway through construction, using the same foundation." Kessin moved closer, studying the readout over his shoulder. "Show me the original blueprint fragments we acquired 14 years ago, the ones our current design is based on." Oret pulled up the archived schematics, and Kessin spent a long moment comparing them, line by line, against the completed core in front of her. Slowly, her expression shifted from professional curiosity to something closer to horrified understanding. "They knew," she said quietly. "Whoever gave up these fragments, whoever we stole them from originally, knew exactly what was missing from them. They knew we would fill in the gaps ourselves, using our own engineering assumptions, and they knew that whatever assumptions we made would be wrong in one specific, catastrophic way. This wasn't a design that we happened to build a flaw into. This was a flaw they left for us to build, on purpose, 14 years in advance, on the chance that we might one day steal a second, completed piece of the same puzzle." "That's not possible," Oret said. "Nobody plans that far ahead. Nobody sets a trap 14 years before springing it." Kessin was quiet for a long moment, looking at the dead, perfect core in front of her, thinking about patience on a scale that unsettled her more than any weapon could have. "The humans did," she said finally, "and we walked directly into every step of it, exactly the way they must have known we would." Her final report, submitted to the High Council 5 days later, did not make comfortable reading. It confirmed, in careful technical language, everything Grand Marshal Doran had already suspected. The disaster had not been an accident, a malfunction, or a lucky strike. It had been a deliberate, patiently constructed trap, built around a precise understanding of Vantar intelligence methods, Vantar engineering habits, and Vantar military psychology, sprung only when the hegemony chose, of its own free will, to steal exactly the piece of technology it had been offered. News of Kessin's findings spread through Vantar military and political circles within days, and the effect on morale was almost as damaging as the fleet losses themselves. For 15 years, the hegemony's rapid rise to regional dominance had been built, quietly and half-acknowledged, on the assumption that the humans were simply too slow, too cautious, too limited in resources to seriously oppose a policy of steady technological theft. That assumption now lay in ruins, alongside 70% of the fleet. Meanwhile, on the human side of the border, news of the disaster reached ordinary people far more slowly, and in far less detail, than it had spread through Vantar political circles. The full plan remained classified at the highest levels, known only to a handful of officials, and the small crew at Anchor Point, who had lived through it directly. What the public eventually learned, through carefully worded government statements released over the following 2 weeks, was a simplified version of events. A Vantar raiding force had attacked a remote human research station, stolen an experimental prototype vessel, and suffered an unexpected and catastrophic technical failure across much of their fleet shortly afterward. for reasons that remained, officially, under investigation. It was enough to spark public celebration across human space regardless. For the first time in 15 years of quiet, grinding anxiety about Vantar power and Vantar raids, ordinary people felt something like relief, even without understanding exactly why. News channels replayed grainy sensor footage of the battle at Anchor Point, presenting Marcus Reyes's outnumbered defense as a heroic last stand, rather than the carefully staged performance it had actually been. Marcus found the coverage deeply uncomfortable, watching reporters praise the courage of a fight he had specifically designed to be survivable rather than victorious, but he said nothing publicly that would contradict the official story, and neither did any of the crew who had lived through that night. Sarah Chen, recovering from the minor injuries she had sustained during her ejection, found herself unexpectedly labeled a hero by news outlets that had somehow obtained footage of her final desperate maneuvers protecting the Meridian before its capture. She gave a single carefully worded statement to the press, arranged in advance by Fleet Public Relations, thanking her crewmates and expressing hope for continued peace along the border, and then declined every further interview request, uncomfortable with praise for a performance rather than a genuine act of heroism, even though she had, in fact, flown that ship exactly as well as any true emergency would have demanded. Elena Voss watched all of this from Anchor Point, with a complicated mixture of feelings. She had built the trap to protect her people, and it had worked exactly as intended. But watching the public celebrate a story that was only half true, built on a heroism that was real but reframed, made her uneasy, in ways she found difficult to fully explain, even to Marcus, who understood the plan better than almost anyone else alive. "They deserve to know the truth eventually," she told him one evening, watching a news broadcast in the station's small common room, the volume turned low. "Not the classified details, maybe, but they deserve to know that we chose this. But that it wasn't luck, or an accident, or a stroke of good fortune in the middle of a battle we were losing. It was a decision, made deliberately, to prevent a much larger war before it could start. Maybe someday," Marcus said, "but not yet. Not while the situation with the Vantar is still this unstable. Right now, the less they know about what we're capable of planning 14 years in advance, the safer everyone is, on both sides of the border." Elena nodded slowly, though the discomfort did not fully leave her. Outside the window, the stars burned steady and indifferent, the way they always had, entirely unaware of the quiet, careful war that had just been fought and won without a single planet-scale battle, and entirely unaware of the harder, more uncertain conflict that was only just beginning, the question of what came next, for two civilizations that had just learned, in the span of a single sleepless week, exactly how far the other was willing to go. Late that night, long after Marcus had gone to check on the repair crews and the common room had emptied out, Elena remained at the window a while longer, thinking about Dr. Prel Kesson, a Vantar engineer she had never met and never would, who was at that very moment, somewhere across the border, reaching the same conclusions Elena had spent 11 years, hoping someone eventually would. She wondered if Kesson felt anything like what she herself felt now. Not triumph, not really, but the strange, heavy quiet of having built something meant to end a danger, only to discover that ending one danger rarely closes a door so much as it opens a different one, narrower and harder to see the far side of. She did not know what the Vantar hegemony would choose to become in the aftermath of this. Nobody did yet, not even the Vantar themselves. All she could do, all any of them could do, was wait, and watch, and be ready to answer whatever came next, with the same patience that had carried her this far. 3 weeks after the resonance pulse tore through Vantar space, Grand Marshal Kesh Doran stood before the full High Council on Threvash Prime, in a hearing that would decide not only his own future but, in many ways, the future direction of the entire hegemony. The council chamber was full that day, every seat occupied, galleries packed with military officers, journalists, and representatives from every major Vantar political faction. Doran wore his formal uniform, the ceremonial version he had not worn in years, and he stood at the center of the chamber floor, with the calm, careful bearing of a man who had already accepted whatever judgment was coming. Councillor Threl Van, who had spent the past 3 weeks quietly building support among factions, eager to place blame somewhere convenient, opened the questioning, with barely concealed hostility. "Grand Marshal, You approved a raid on human territory, based on intelligence, that a valuable prototype was lightly defended. You proceeded despite warnings from your own subordinate that the situation felt, in her words, too easy. As a direct result of your decision, this hegemony has lost the use of 70% of its fleet, an economic and military catastrophe that will take a decade or more to fully repair. How do you answer for this? Doran had expected this question, or one very much like it, and he had spent 3 weeks deciding how he wanted to answer it. He could have defended his decision on the grounds that any reasonable commander, given the same intelligence, would have made the same choice. He could have pointed out, accurately, that the technology theft policy that made this trap possible had been hegemony doctrine for a decade before he ever gave the order, approved and celebrated by councils that had never once questioned where the sudden advantages kept coming from. He could have spread the blame widely enough to make it stick to no one in particular, which was, he understood, exactly what Counselor Van expected him to attempt. Instead, he chose a different path. I answer for it honestly, Counselor, he said. I made the decision. I dismissed a legitimate concern raised by a capable officer because it did not fit the pattern of 15 years of successful operations. I assumed that a policy which had worked reliably in the past would continue to work indefinitely, and I failed to consider that our enemy might eventually learn to use our own patterns against us. That failure is mine, and I do not ask this council to excuse it. A murmur ran through the gallery. This was not the defense anyone had expected from a man with Doran's reputation for careful, controlled leadership. However, Doran continued, before the murmur could fully settle, I would ask this council to consider a harder question than the one Counselor Van has raised. The question is not simply, why did this raid fail? The question is, why did we build an entire military doctrine, over 15 years, on a foundation of theft rather than invention? Every counselor in this chamber benefited from the rapid growth our fleet experienced during that period. Very few asked hard questions about where that growth was truly coming from. I made the mistake of executing a flawed policy. This council made the mistake of approving that policy, year after year, without ever demanding that our own engineers build something we could trust, because we understood it, rather than something we could only use because someone else had already understood it for us. The chamber fell into a heavier silence than before. Counselor Van's face had gone rigid with anger, but Counselor Morn, watching from her seat near the center of the gathered council, allowed herself a small, thoughtful nod. This council will deliberate on the Grand Marshal's fitness for continued command, Morn said finally, cutting through the tension, before it could boil over into open argument. But I believe the Grand Marshal has raised a question this council cannot avoid answering, regardless of what becomes of his own career. We built our strength on borrowed foundations, and those foundations have failed us in the worst possible way, at the worst possible moment. The real question before us today is not only what happened to Grand Marshal Doran's raiding force. It is what kind of hegemony we intend to be going forward, now that the door to easy theft has been shown to lead somewhere far more dangerous than we ever imagined. The council's deliberations stretched on for 2 more days before a final decision was reached. Doran was formally relieved of his fleet command, a censure that ended, for all practical purposes, his active military career, though he was permitted to retain his rank and pension in recognition of decades of otherwise honorable service. It was, by Vantar political standards, a relatively mild punishment for a disaster of this magnitude, a sign that even his harshest critics understood, on some level, that the true failure ran far deeper than one officer's decisions. More significantly, the council announced the formation of a new policy commission, tasked with reviewing every aspect of Vantar military technology development and, for the first time in the hegemony's modern history, seriously considering a shift away from acquisition through theft and toward genuine independent research and diplomatic technology sharing agreements. It was a slow, uncertain first step, opposed bitterly by factions that had profited from the old system, but it was a step nonetheless, and word of it reached human intelligence channels within days. At Anchor Point, Elena Voss read the intelligence summary of the council's decision with cautious relief. They're actually considering it, she told Marcus, showing him the report over breakfast in the station's small officers' mess. A genuine shift in doctrine. It's not guaranteed to pass. There's significant opposition, but the fact that they're even debating it publicly is more than I expected this quickly. You expected something, Marcus said, buttering a piece of toast with the deliberate care of a man who had learned, over the past month, to take small comforts wherever he could find them. You always expect something. What did you expect? Honestly? I expected either total denial and an attempt to hide what happened from their own public, or an immediate push toward retaliation, Elena said. This middle path, actual self-reflection, wasn't the most likely outcome in my models. I'm glad to be wrong. Your models accounted for the possibility they might just attack us instead, Marcus said. It was not quite a question. Of course they did, Elena said. That was always the largest single risk in this entire plan. A wounded, humiliated power sometimes lashes out precisely because it has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. That's why the president kept 2 full defense fleets on heightened alert for the first 2 weeks after the pulse triggered. Quietly, without public announcement. We were prepared for retaliation. We built contingencies for it. I'm relieved, more than I can easily explain, that we haven't needed them. Not every response within Vantar space was as measured as the High Council's official position, however. In the weeks following the disaster, a hardline faction calling itself the Reclamation Movement began gaining unexpected traction among segments of the Vantar population, humiliated by the scale of the fleet's losses. Their message was simple and dangerously appealing to frightened, angry people. The humans had committed an act of war, disguised as an accident, and honor demanded a direct and overwhelming response, regardless of the cost. The movement's most visible leader, a former fleet captain named Rurik Nathis, who had lost his own ship in the resonance pulse, began appearing on Vantar public broadcasts, calling for immediate mobilization of the remaining 30% of the fleet for a retaliatory strike against human territory. They call it self-defense, Nathis said, in one widely circulated broadcast that human intelligence flagged and translated within hours of its airing. They call their trap a defensive measure, built to protect a peaceful people from aggression. I ask you, does a peaceful people spend 14 years constructing a weapon designed specifically to cripple an entire civilization's ability to defend itself? Does a peaceful people celebrate, in the quiet halls of their government, when that weapon finally claims its prize? We were not defeated in honest battle. We were deceived, patiently, cruelly, over more than a decade, by a species that wears the mask of restraint while planning our destruction in the dark. The rhetoric found fertile ground among Vantar citizens, still reeling from the scale of the losses, and within a month, Nathes's movement had grown from a fringe voice to a genuine political force, pressuring the weakened High Council from one direction, while more moderate factions pushed for restraint and reform from another. Marcus brought the intelligence on Nathes's growing movement to Elena personally, his expression grave. This is the retaliation scenario your models worried about. It might not come from official Vantar military command. It might come from a popular movement that eventually forces the Council's hand, whether they want a war or not. Elena studied the translated broadcast transcripts carefully, her earlier relief tempering into renewed caution. Nathis isn't entirely wrong, you know, she said quietly. Not about the facts. We did plan this for years. We did celebrate when it worked. He's building his case on things that actually happened, just told from an angle designed to make restraint look like weakness and retaliation look like honor. That's what makes movements like his dangerous. The most effective lies are always built on a foundation of real truth. So what do? We stay ready, Elena said, and we make sure the moderates on their council, people like Councillor Morn, understand that we have no interest in further escalation, that everything we did was defensive in nature, and intended to prevent exactly the kind of large-scale war Nathes is now trying to provoke. If they choose war anyway, driven by a popular movement their own weakened government can't control, then we will be ready to defend ourselves. But I still believe, even now, that the wiser path for both our peoples is the one their council has already started walking. We should do everything in our power, quietly and diplomatically, to help them stay on it. Over the following 2 months, that quiet diplomatic effort became the primary focus of human foreign policy toward the Vantar hegemony, conducted almost entirely outside public view. Secret channels, established years earlier for exactly this kind of crisis management, carried careful messages between human diplomats and moderate Vantar counselors, offering assurances, proposing formal treaty frameworks, and, in a gesture that surprised even some of Elena's own colleagues, offering limited technical assistance to help the hegemony rebuild its damaged fleet, using genuinely independent, non-stolen engineering principles. "We're helping them rebuild the very fleet that attacked us?" Marcus asked, when Elena first explained the proposal to him. "We're helping them rebuild it in a way that doesn't require them to keep stealing from us, or from anyone else, to stay competitive," Elena said. "A Vantar hegemony that has learned to build its own strength honestly is a far safer neighbor than a Vantar hegemony that has simply gone quiet for a while, before returning to the old pattern the moment its embarrassment fades. This isn't charity, Marcus. It's the second half of the same plan. The trap stopped the theft. The rebuilding assistance is what gives them a real alternative to going back to it." The moment of greatest danger came 9 weeks after the disaster, when Rurik Nathis and a small but determined group of sympathetic officers attempted something that history would later remember as the Thravash incident. Nathis had spent weeks cultivating contacts within the remaining 30% of the Vantar fleet, still capable of faster-than-light travel, the newer vessels that had not relied on the compromised engine architecture. Using forged council authorization codes obtained through sympathizers inside the fleet's own bureaucracy, he attempted to mobilize a squadron of 6 operational cruisers for what he called a defensive demonstration along the human border, a show of force intended to prove that the hegemony was not as helpless as the resonance pulse had made it appear. Grand Marshal Doran, stripped of his command but still respected by many officers who had served under him for decades, learned of the plan through an old contact only hours before the squadron was set to depart. Despite his own censure, despite having every reason to feel bitter toward the council that had ended his career, he made the decision that would ultimately define how history remembered him far more than the disaster at Anchor Point ever would. He went, alone and without authorization of his own, directly to the departure platform, where Nathes's squadron was preparing to launch, and stood in the middle of the boarding ramp of the lead cruiser, refusing to move. "You have no authority here," Nathes told him, furious, as fleet security scrambled to understand what was happening. "You were relieved of command. This is not your fleet to command, or to stop." "I am not stopping it as a Grand Marshal," Doran said, his voice carrying clearly across the platform to the assembled crews, many of whom had served under him at some point in their careers, and had gathered to watch the confrontation unfold. "I am stopping it as a man who has seen exactly what happens when we act on anger and certainty instead of patience and evidence. I built my career trusting that boldness would always be rewarded, and caution was for lesser officers. I was wrong, and it cost this hegemony more than any of you standing here today can fully measure yet. Rurik, you are about to make the same mistake I made, except this time, instead of losing ships, we may lose everything the Council has spent 9 weeks quietly trying to save." The standoff lasted nearly 3 hours, watched by a growing crowd of off-duty officers and, eventually, by Council security forces summoned once word of the unauthorized launch attempt reached Thravash Prime. In the end, it was not Doran's authority that stopped Nathis, since he had none left to invoke, but the simple, stubborn fact that enough of the assembled crew, watching 2 respected officers argue in front of them, chose to side with caution over anger. One by one, the boarding crews began stepping back from their stations, unwilling to follow orders that Doran, whatever his current rank, clearly believed would lead to disaster. Nathes was arrested within the hour on charges of attempted unauthorized military action, a serious offense that effectively ended the reclamation movement's political momentum, though its underlying anger did not disappear entirely, merely retreated to simmer beneath the surface of Vantar public life, waiting for some future crisis to reawaken it. News of the Thravash incident reached Anchor Point 2 days later, relayed through the same careful diplomatic channels that had been quietly working to keep the peace. Elena read the report twice, then set it down and let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Doran stopped it," she told Marcus, something like disbelief coloring her voice. "The same man who ordered the raid that started all of this. He's the one who stopped a war from breaking out over its consequences." "People aren't always just one thing," Marcus said. Maybe he learned something from watching his whole fleet go dark that none of the counselors debating policy from a comfortable chamber could have learned any other way. "Maybe," Elena agreed. "Or maybe he simply understood, better than anyone else in that hegemony right now, exactly how badly a plan built on confidence and old assumptions can go wrong when it meets an opponent patient enough to wait 14 years for the right moment. Either way, I think we owe him something, even if he'll never know it, and even if he'd probably rather not hear it from us directly. The Vantar High Council, shaken by how close the Thravash incident had come to reigniting open conflict, moved more decisively in its aftermath than it had in the 2 months prior. Within weeks, the Technology Policy Commission that had been debating slowly and cautiously produced its first formal recommendations, calling for a gradual, verified transition away from acquisition-based military development and toward independently verified research programs, alongside a formal proposal to establish a permanent diplomatic channel with human authorities. The first such channel either government had seriously proposed in 15 years of tension. It was not peace, not yet, not in any complete or guaranteed sense. But it was, Elena thought, as she read through the summary of the Commission's recommendations late one evening at Anchor Point, the first real step either civilization had taken toward something better than the quiet, grinding hostility that had defined the border between them for so long. Whether that step would hold, whether the moderate voices on both sides could continue to outweigh the angrier ones stirred up by fear and humiliation, remained an open question. But for the first time since she had begun designing the Meridian's hidden core 11 years earlier, Elena allowed herself to believe that the answer to that question might, eventually, turn out to be yes. On the human side of the border, the President and her small circle of advisors faced a quieter but no less difficult question of their own: how much of the truth to eventually share with the public. Sarah Chen, still occasionally recognized on the street as the pilot from the Anchor Point battle, found the burden of an incomplete story growing heavier with each passing month, though she never spoke of it publicly. Marcus raised the issue directly with visiting officials from the Defense Ministry during a review of Anchor Point's ongoing operations. "My people fought a real battle with real injuries, based on a plan they didn't fully understand," he told the visiting undersecretary bluntly. "I respect the need for secrecy, while things are still unstable across the border. But there needs to be a plan for honesty eventually, or we risk becoming the kind of government that treats its own citizens the way the old Vantar system treated theirs, feeding them a comfortable story instead of the truth they've earned." The undersecretary, a careful and measured woman named Adaisy Fallon, did not dismiss the concern. "There is a plan," she assured him. "A phased declassification, once the diplomatic situation stabilizes enough that revealing the full scope of the operation won't be read as a provocation. Dr. Voss has already begun drafting the public account herself. It won't be quick, but it won't be forgotten, either." Marcus accepted this, not entirely satisfied, but willing to trust that the slow, careful patience which had built the trap in the first place would, in time, extend to the telling of its story as well. 8 months after the resonance pulse tore through Vantar space, a formal treaty delegation arrived at a neutral space station on the border between human and Vantar territory, the first such meeting between the two governments since the disaster. The station, called Meeting Point by the humans, and something roughly translating to Common Ground by the Vantar, had been built decades earlier, during an earlier, briefer period of cautious cooperation, and had sat mostly unused for years as tensions between the two powers grew. Now its docking bays were full again, human diplomatic shuttles resting alongside Vantar transports for the first time in longer than most of the delegates present could remember. Elena Voss had not expected to be part of the human delegation. Her work, as far as she understood it, had ended the day the resonance pulse triggered. But the president's office had specifically requested her presence, and when Elena had asked why, the answer she received surprised her. "Because Councillor Morn requested it," the Secretary of Defense told her, during the briefing before departure. The moderates on the Vantar Council have been pushing hard for this meeting, and Morn specifically asked that the engineer responsible for the trap be present. She wants to look the person who outthought their entire military doctrine in the eye, in person, before she puts her name on any treaty. "That seems like an unusual request," Elena said. "It is," the secretary agreed. "But Councillor Morn has become one of the most important voices for peace on their side of this negotiation, and if meeting you helps her trust the process, then you're going, Dr. Voss, whether it's unusual or not." The meeting itself took place in a large, neutral conference chamber at the center of the station, human and Vantar delegates seated across a long table, translators and aides arranged carefully behind each principal negotiator. Elena sat near the back of the human delegation, close enough to observe, not centrally placed enough to be mistaken for one of the primary negotiators, exactly as she had requested. The negotiations themselves were slow and difficult, stretching across 3 full days of careful, sometimes tense discussion. The Vantar delegation, led by Councillor Morn herself, pushed for formal recognition that the resonance trap had constituted an act of extraordinary force, deserving of both acknowledgement and constraint against any similar future action. The human delegation, led by Secretary Fallon, pushed equally hard for formal recognition that 15 years of systematic technology theft had created the conditions that made such a drastic response necessary in the first place, and sought binding commitments preventing any return to that policy. By the 3rd day, exhausted negotiators on both sides had produced a draft framework that satisfied neither delegation completely, which experienced diplomats on both sides understood to be the surest sign of a genuinely balanced agreement. The treaty, which would come to be known as the Meeting Point Accord, established formal technology sharing protocols between the two governments, created a joint commission to investigate and mediate any future disputes over intellectual property and military development, and included, buried in its technical annexes, a mutual commitment that neither government would develop or deploy weapons designed to exploit systemic vulnerabilities in the other's critical infrastructure, without formal declaration and warning. It was this last clause, more than any other, that brought Councillor Morn to Elena's side of the room during a break in the final day's proceedings. "Dr. Voss," Morn said, approaching with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who had spent a long career learning to move without haste. "I wanted to speak with you directly before this meeting concludes." Elena stood, unsure of the proper protocol, and settled for a respectful nod. "Counselor, it's an honor." "I am not certain honor is the right word for what I feel meeting you," Morn said, not unkindly. "I have read the technical reports our engineers compiled after the disaster. I understand, as well as anyone outside your own government can understand, exactly what you built, and exactly how long you waited to see it used. It is a remarkable piece of engineering. It is also, I think, one of the more frightening things I have encountered in a very long career of encountering frightening things." "I understand," Elena said quietly. "I don't ask you to feel comfortable about it, Counselor. I only hope you understand it was never meant as an act of aggression. It was meant to end a threat before it could grow into something neither of our peoples could survive." Morn studied her for a long moment, her expression difficult to read. Grand Marshal Doran told the council something similar, in his testimony, though from the other direction. He said your people think differently than we assumed, that we built our advantage on speed and boldness, while you built yours on patience so deep, it took us 15 years to even notice it was there. She paused. I find myself agreeing with him, though it took losing most of our fleet to understand it. I want you to know, Dr. Voss, that I intend to support this treaty, and I intend to keep supporting the reforms our commission has proposed, not because I have forgiven what happened at Anchor Point, but because I believe the alternative, a return to the old pattern of theft and resentment, ends somewhere far worse for both our peoples than where we currently stand. That's all any of us hoped for, Elena said, a reason to choose something better than the pattern we were already following. Morn nodded slowly, then turned to look out through the chamber's wide viewport, at the stars burning steadily beyond the glass, human and Vantar space both visible from this particular vantage point at the border between them. May I ask you something, Doctor? Purely out of curiosity, engineer to whoever it is that a mind like yours belongs to. Of course. If we had not stolen your ship, Morn said, if Grand Marshal Doran had listened to his own subordinates' doubts and called off the raid, what would have happened to your trap then? Elena considered the question carefully before answering. Nothing, she said finally. The Meridian would have entered production as advertised, the fastest ship humanity had ever built, exactly as it appeared to be. The trap only exists because it was stolen. If your people had never taken the bait, there would have been no pulse, no crippled fleet, none of what followed. The choice to spring the trap was never ours to make, Counselor. It was always yours. Morn was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. That is either the most reassuring or the most unsettling thing anyone has told me this week, she said finally. I have not yet decided which. Perhaps it can be both, Elena offered. I've found, over the past 8 months, that most important things usually are. The meeting point accord was signed on the final day of negotiations, in a brief, formal ceremony, attended by delegates from both governments and broadcast, for the first time, to the general public on both sides of the border. It was at this same ceremony that the human government made its long-delayed announcement, revealing to its own citizens the true scope of what had happened at Anchor Point 8 months earlier. Not a lucky escape from a losing battle, but a carefully designed operation, patiently constructed over more than a decade, intended to end a growing threat before it could mature into open war. The public reaction was complicated, as Elena had known it would be. Some celebrated the revelation as proof of quiet, patient strength, a story of a small, careful people outthinking a much larger and more aggressive power, without firing a single decisive shot in anger. Others were troubled by the scale of the deception involved, by the years of careful planning that had gone into a device meant to cripple an entire foreign fleet, and by the ethical questions that came with building such a thing in the first place, however defensively it had ultimately been justified. Marcus Reyes, watching the public debate unfold from Anchor Point in the weeks following the announcement, found himself agreeing, at different moments, with both sides of the argument. Sarah Chen, finally free to speak publicly about the true nature of her role in the operation, gave a single extended interview several weeks after the announcement, in which she spoke candidly about what it had felt like to fly a ship she knew was bait, to eject from it deliberately rather than in true emergency, and to carry the weight of a secret for 8 months, while the public celebrated a simpler, less complicated version of her actions. "I don't regret what I did," she told the interviewer, sitting in a quiet studio far from the dark hangar where it had all begun. "I trusted Dr. Voss and Captain Reyes, and that trust turned out to be well placed. But I think it's important for people to understand that what happened at Anchor Point wasn't a lucky break in a desperate fight. It was a choice, made carefully, by people who understood exactly what they were risking and exactly what they hoped to gain. I'd rather live in a world that makes hard, careful choices like that one, openly and honestly, than in a world that stumbles into disaster and calls it fate." Grand Marshal Kesh Doran, watching a translated broadcast of the same interview from his modest retirement quarters near Thravash Prime, found himself nodding slowly at Sarah's words, understanding them, perhaps, better than most humans watching the same broadcast ever could. He had spent the 8 months since his censure in quiet reflection, watching the slow, uncertain rebuilding of the fleet he had once commanded, and watching, with a complicated mixture of resentment and grudging respect, the diplomatic progress that had emerged from the wreckage of his greatest failure. He had not been invited to the treaty signing, he had not expected to be, but he had followed every detail of the negotiations from a distance, and when the meeting point accord was finally signed, he allowed himself, for the first time since the resonance pulse had plunged his flagship into darkness, something close to relief. 1 year after the disaster at Anchor Point, Elena Voss stood once again in the hangar where the Meridian had once rested, now home to a very different kind of project, a joint human Vantar research initiative, established under the terms of the new treaty, working to develop drive technology that belonged fully and honestly to both civilizations, rather than being stolen piecemeal by either one. It was slow, careful, unglamorous work, nothing like the dramatic trap that had brought the two governments to this point. But Elena found she preferred it that way. Traps, however necessary, however carefully built, were not something she ever wanted to build again if she could help it. Marcus found her there one evening, watching a small team of human and Vantar engineers work together on an early prototype core, their voices a mixture of 2 languages and 2 very different engineering traditions, slowly learning to speak a common technical dialect. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" he said, standing beside her. "A year ago, this hangar held the most dangerous secret either of our governments had ever built. Now it's just this." "I think that's the whole point," Elena said, watching the engineers work, the light from their diagnostic screens casting a gentler glow than the deep blue pulse she remembered from a year before. The Meridian did exactly what it was built to do. It stopped a war before it could properly start. But a trap can only ever be the beginning of a solution, never the whole of it. This, she gestured at the mixed team of engineers working together across the hangar floor. This is what the ending is actually supposed to look like. Not a clever device that outsmarts an enemy in 3 minutes. Just people, from 2 different worlds, slowly learning to build something honest, together, one careful step at a time. Marcus considered this for a long moment, watching the quiet, ordinary work unfolding in front of them, so different from the desperate battle that had once filled this same space with fire and fear. 11 years to build the trap, he said finally. How long do you think this part takes? Elena smiled, a real smile, tired but genuine, the first one Marcus had seen from her, in longer than he could easily remember. Longer, she admitted. But I think, this time, that's exactly as it should be. The negotiations at meeting point had not been without their own moments of near collapse, moments that never made it into the public record, but which Elena remembered vividly, even a year later, standing in the quiet hangar. On the second day of talks, the discussion had nearly broken down entirely over the question of reparations. A faction within the Vantar delegation, still smarting from the scale of the fleet's losses, had pushed hard for formal compensation from the human government, arguing that regardless of the provocation, the material damage inflicted on Vantar infrastructure deserved some form of restitution. Secretary Fallon had resisted this framing firmly, concerned that any formal admission implying the trap had been an act of aggression rather than defense would undermine the entire legal basis for the treaty, and might embolden exactly the kind of hardline factions that had nearly succeeded in the Thravash incident. For nearly 6 hours, the talks stalled completely, both delegations retreating to separate chambers, aides shuttling careful messages back and forth in place of direct conversation. It was Councillor Morn, ultimately, who broke the impasse, proposing a compromise that satisfied the letter of both positions without fully resolving the underlying disagreement. Rather than reparations framed as an admission of wrongdoing, the treaty would include a mutual technology assistance program, formally described as a shared investment in regional stability, rather than compensation for damages. Vantar engineers would receive genuine assistance rebuilding their fleet using independent designs. Human technical advisors would assist where welcomed, and neither side would ever be required to publicly frame the arrangement as an admission that the other had acted wrongly. It was, Elena reflected afterward, a very Vantar solution, and a very human one at the same time, built on the shared, unspoken understanding that sometimes the fastest way through an old wound is not to argue over who caused it, but to focus every available effort on healing it instead. The final day of talks brought one more difficult moment, this one arriving not through formal negotiation, but through an unscheduled request. Grand Marshal Doran, though no longer holding any official position within the Vantar military or government, had traveled to meeting point on his own initiative, requesting, through Councillor Morn, a brief audience with the human delegation before the treaty's signing. The request caused some concern among Secretary Fallon's security staff, given Doran's role in initiating the original raid, but Elena, when consulted, argued strongly in favor of granting it. He stopped the Thravash incident, she reminded the secretary. He put himself between an angry mob of officers and a war neither side truly wanted. Whatever role he played 8 months ago, I think the man who stood on that boarding ramp deserves to be heard now. Doran was granted a brief 15 minutes with the human delegation, and he used them plainly, without ceremony. He offered no elaborate apology, no attempt to excuse the raid he had ordered. Instead, he spoke directly to Elena, having apparently learned, through channels she never fully discovered, exactly who had designed the trap that ended his career. I do not know if the word forgiveness belongs in a conversation between two people who were, until recently, positioned as enemies of each other's people, he said, his translated voice carrying a formality that did not quite hide the genuine weight behind it. But I wanted you to know, Dr. Voss, engineer to engineer, in whatever sense that phrase can apply between our two kinds, that I understand what you built, and I no longer resent it, even though it ended everything I had spent 40 years building for myself. A weapon that disables an entire fleet while sparing nearly every life aboard it is not the weapon of an enemy seeking destruction. It is the weapon of someone hoping, against long odds, that the people on the other end of it might one day choose to build something better instead. I intend to spend whatever years I have left helping to make sure that hope was not wasted. Elena had not expected to feel moved by anything a Vantar Grand Marshal said to her, and yet she found herself unable to offer anything more than a quiet, sincere thank you, the two of them standing for a moment in a silence that needed no translation at all. Outside the hangar, beyond the reinforced windows, The stars continued their slow, patient wheel across the dark, indifferent to the quiet, careful work of two civilizations learning, at last, how to build something together, instead of stealing it from each other in the shadows. It had taken a stolen ship, a broken fleet, and 3 of the longest minutes in the history of either people to bring them to this point. But standing in that hangar, watching engineers who had once been enemies bend over a shared design together, Elena Voss allowed herself, finally, to believe that it had been worth every long, careful year it had taken to get here.